Hello, my name is Olurotimi Osha. I like to talk about American presidents and I discuss US law, American history. I'm continuing with my discussion on the anti Semitic lynching of Leo Frank, which happened in um, August uh, 1915. Now, the trial occurred in 1913 after Mary Fagan her body had been found. She'd been murdered in April 26, 1913. Our president at the time was Woodrow Wilson. And the day she was actually killed was supposed to be, it was the Confederates' Day. They were celebrating the Confederates' Day in Georgia. This happened. She was from Marietta, Georgia. Today, what I want to do is take a look at the evidence that was used to wrongfully convict Leo Frank. The evidence was very weak, right? And I graduated from George Washington University Law School, and I remember I took a course, and we were often, our professors often told us, at least my professors told us at the time, that we want to focus on direct evidence. Direct evidence is what's, stronger, it's what's definitive and dispositive. Circumstantial evidence is weak. But in reality, uh, you know, very strong, circumstantial evidence can be put together in such a way that it actually seems more persuasive than direct evidence. By the way, let me just define what direct and circumstantial evidence, the difference between circumstantial and direct evidence. Direct evidence is straightforward, right? It's basically straightforward proof, right? For instance, if there's eyewitness who saw a defendant actually committing the crime. For instance, if the defendant actually saw, the defendant, Leo Frank, actually killing, Mary Fagan, that never happened. The defendant never saw Leo Frank killing Mary Fagan, right? Um, a confession can be direct evidence. For instance, if Leo Frank had confessed to someone that he did kill, the victim Mary Fagan, then that would be direct evidence, right? And that's very strong enough to convict. Um, Leo Frank. Now, did Leo Frank confess to anybody? He didn't confess to his wife, not to his friends, not to the police. He didn't confess at court when he was examined, and was cross-examined. He didn't confess at any time. However, Jim Conley, right? Jim Conley, the janitor, the black 27-year-old black janitor, um, who in his testimony he said to have he claimed, on examination, that Leo Frank, um, that he came up and saw Leo Frank holding a rope in his hands, jute rope in his hands, and he said that he hit her, he'd struck her, that he tried to have intercourse with her, and she resisted. That's Mary Fagan, the lit 13-year-old girl, and she resisted him, and he struck her, and her head hit something, and uh, that's basically direct evidence, right? So that's direct evidence. But the thing is, could the testimony of Jim Conley be believed? Was it credible, right? Jim Conley, upon cross examination, was admitted that he had lied, right? There were several contradictions in his testimony. And by the way, Jim Conley was the one who was believed um, to have actually killed Mary Fagan, the 13-year-old white girl. So the direct evidence that ended up convicting Leo Frank was the testimony of Jim Conley, who was said to have been the killer, but there was no evidence. The prosecution hid they suppressed evidence that could have been used to show that Jim Conley was the one who actually killed Mary Fagan. So the other evidence that was brought forward against Leo Frank was circumstantial evidence. So circumstantial evidence is not direct evidence. It uses inference, right? It uses inference for the judge or the jury they put circumstantial evidence together. For instance, an example of circumstantial evidence can be fingerprints on a gun or seeing the defendant running away from the scene of the crime, right? So the jury, it's left to the jury or the judge to put that circumstantial evidence together, right? Put it together, connect the dots, and make a conclusion, right? On the other hand, direct evidence is, it's straightforward proof, and if it's believed by the judge or the jury, it resolves the matter, right? So that's the difference. So there was a lot of circumstantial evidence against Leo Frank. The only direct evidence that was, against him was the testimony of Jim Conley, who said, well, Leo Frank admitted that he had tried to have sex. He had tried to force himself uh, on Mary Fagan. She resisted, and when she resisted, he struck her hard, and her head hit something. And he also had he didn't admit to strangling her, right? Uh, but that he Jim Conley said uh, he saw a rope in his hand. So that's circumstantial evidence, right? That's circumstantial evidence. Now, the coroner, on examining the body of Mary Fagan, found that she'd been, the death was by strangulation, and of course, there was a rope, there was a jute rope that was next to her corpse. Um, Additionally, her skull, there was a dent in her skull had been dented, so which corroborates what Jim Conley said, that Leo Frank had said that he hit her head, and when he struck her, her head hit something, right? And so there was also a cake of blood, on her head. Um, so additionally, the now apart from that piece of direct evidence, and of course, mostly circumstantial evidence, the doctors, when they examined her body, right, um, they so there was a very salacious nature to the trial. There was a lot of salacious um, there was a lot of salacious aspect, rather salacious aspect of the trial. Um, when the when one of the doctors examined the prosecution doctor examined the body of Mary Fagan, he said that the vagina had an injury. Right, there was an injury to the vagina that occurred, about 30 minutes, a few minutes prior to uh, her murder. Right, and he observed the hymen. The hymen there was an injury to the hymen as well. However, another prosecution doctor contradicted this doctor's testimony. So that perfect earlier doctor was basically saying that, well, that's basically corroborating Jim Conley's testimony that, well, the Leo Franklin said he had tried to force himself on her. So the idea was that Leo Frank or somebody, that she had been raped, right? That she had been murdered while she was being sexually assaulted or after she had been sexually assaulted. However, there was another doctor who contradicted that testimony. And he was a prosecution doctor as well. He said he didn't see and that there was no damage to the hymen, right? So one doctor said, well, there was damage to the hymen. She was a 13-year-old girl. There was another doctor who said, no, there was no damage to the hymen. So in any event, the prosecution, right there, the strategy was to portray Leo Frank as a very salacious character, as a womanizer, as a philanderer, as a some kind of pervert, who had been molesting women, who had been sexually harassing women, and his objective was to sexually harass, was to assault, rape, Mary, the 13-year-old worker, Mary Fagan, who had just gone there to collect her meager wages, right? She went there to collect $1.20, for her whole work. She worked around 10 to 12 cents an hour, right? Um, so the prosecution, tried to portray um, uh, uh, Leo Frank as a lecherous, wealthy uh, Jewish man from New York, who just sort of to be consistent with the um, with the Southern narrative at the time of capitalist, right? New York capitalists coming from the North to violate and exploit white Southern womanhood, right? So this was what was going on. This was a narrative that the prosecution was running with. Um, and so you see, they brought a lot of witnesses. The prosecution would bring a lot of witnesses who claimed that um, Leo Frank had, that they'd seen Leo Frank harassing women. There was a woman who came, one of the female workers, who claimed she had seen Leo Frank several times, holding Mary Fagan by the shoulder, and things like that. Meanwhile, Leo Frank, uh, on cross examination, right, had claimed that he didn't even remember the girl, that he just remembered but that she worked there. He didn't have any interaction with her. He didn't know her name. His testimony was that he hardly interacted with her. Meanwhile, there were people who were claiming that in fact there was a guy called George Epps who was Mary Fagan's friend. He was a young man, and he claimed that she'd actually reported Leo Frank to him, that that he'd been harassing her and he'd been showing a prurient interest in her. So that was the narrative of the prosecution. They painted Leo Frank as a lecherous, wealthy man from privileged, wealthy man from New York, who had come with his wealth to exploit southern white female children, right? And he violated the he violated the dignity and the virtue of Mary Fagan, who resisted him. So this was the narrative that was going on, and and there was additional testimony. Of course, it was um, Jim Conley's testimony that was dispositive. In addition, there was another man, the night watchman, um, named Newt Lee. Right, there were actually two pieces of notes. I want to keep this video short, so I'm going to continue, and I'll just read the notes that were allegedly, the objective of these two notes that were found by the body of Mary Fagan was to make it seem like um, she had written those notes, but eventually Jim Conley confessed that he was the one who had written the notes at the behest of Leo Frank, after Leo Frank had confessed to killing Mary Fagan, and Leo Frank had um, elicited the help of uh, Jim Conley to dispose of the body, right? And he promised he would give Jim Conley money to help him dispose of the body. And so Jim Conley claimed that together they wrapped up the body, right? That they took the body from around Jim Conley's office. There was a work, a metal room where this was supposed to have happened by a workbench. There was a lathe by it and a workman's bench. On the second floor by the office of Leo Frank, this is where the murder was supposed to have occurred. And together they used the elevator to take the body down to the basement, right? And that was so the her body, that's Mary Fagan's body, was found on April the 27th around 3 a.m. by the night watchman, an African American, Newt Lee. He found the dead body of Mary Fagan around 3 a.m. and he called the police. Her body was in the basement near the elevator shaft, right? So when he called the police came and they found those notes. Now those notes were supposed to have deflected, thrown suspicion and the blame, culpability on Newt Lee, the night watchman. And so in the testimony in court, Jim Conley said it was Leo Frank who uh, coerced him, dictated the notes to Jim Conley, who wrote it. Blaming, making the Newt Lee, the African American night watchman who discovered the body, making him appear to be the one who um, murdered Mary Fagan. So the notes were supposed to have been written by Mary Fagan, but Jim Conley confessed that he wrote the notes. And so I'm going to do a subsequent video and read the notes. I don't want to keep this too long. So the objective of the prosecution again was to just make Leo Frank appear lecherous, and there were numerous witnesses that were called, testifying as to the lascivious character of um, of Leo Frank, and they made him look like this Jekyll and Hyde character because when you see the picture of Leo Frank, he looks like um, he looks like a staid, upright gentleman, right? He looks very, he was about 30 years old when this happened, probably less than 31, and he looks like a gentle boy. He actually looks like a boy. He looks innocent. He looks angelic, right? He looks staid, right? But the prosecution's job was to project him as a Jekyll and Hyde character. This was just a front. That he's outside um, persona. Right? He was president of this Jewish fraternal organization in Georgia, in Atlanta, Georgia. And the outside persona that he projected was fraudulent. That it was a Jekyll and Hyde character. And later on, when no one's observing, his lecherous nature, his perversion comes out, and he had been trying to exploit female workers. That the female workers, the young female workers, were at his mercy, and Mary Fagan was not his first victim. So this was how they misrepresented him, at trial. Um, so Newt Lee claimed that on the night of the murder, April 26th, at 7 p.m., when he gave his testimony, he said Leo Frank, the manager, called him, and that Leo Frank had never called him before. That Leo Frank called him and he asked if everything was all right there at the factory, and he thought that was odd, right? And he said 2 days after um, the body had been found, after the police and investigators had been interrogating Newt Lee, because initially the attention was drawn, uh, the suspicion was leveled on Newt Lee, the night watchman who discovered the body and called the police, especially since they discovered those notes claiming, trying to put blame on him. But Newt Lee denied it. Now Newt Lee also said that Leo Frank told him that, well, if he puts up with this, that you know, uh, they will both go to hell. So that was, that's circumstantial evidence because that doesn't say anything. But that piece of information by Newt Lee, which the jury found to be very credible, uh, appeared to lay blame on Leo Frank, right? So Newt Lee had been arrested for a few days and he was questioned. In fact, he was tortured by the police. He was a black man, but he pleaded his innocence, and they believed him, and so he was subsequently released, and he was one of the witnesses for on the prosecution side, and that testimony by him that Leo Frank called him, on the night of the murder at 7 p.m., asking him if everything was all right at the factory. And Newt Lee thought that was odd because Leo Frank had never called him before, and that upon on questioning, the fact that Leo Frank said, well, if he keeps up with this, that's his denials, right? That he didn't do anything, that they'd go to hell, right? So because of that, that piece of circumstantial evidence, the jury, it was one of the reasons the jury, were convinced. Now, I should also mention the jury selection during voir dire. Voir dire is jury selection. The the attorneys for Leo Frank, for the defense, led by Luther Rosser, right, and Ruben Arnold, they had struck the only two African American people, right? Uh, you know, it struck them off, right? And meanwhile, the prosecution, they made sure they struck off every, during their peremptory challenges, when they found any uh, member of the jury who was against capital punishment, they struck them off. So the jury was made up of all white men, right? All, lower class white men, 12 of them. Now, amongst them was a guy called Atticus Hensley. Later on, upon, conviction, they found that Atticus Hensley had, when Leo Frank had been indicted by a grand jury, right? That's to charge him with the murder. That he had made a public statement uh, to the Elks Club, that to the Atlanta Elks Club, saying that he wants that Jew to hang, right? That he wants that Jew to hang, and he wants so, which was a prejudicial statement. So, but it's interesting though that later on, after the jury had because the jury, the jury had to vote twice, right? They had to vote twice because they couldn't reach unanimity, right? The jury, all the jury have to vote together. You can't have 11 saying convict and one saying not guilty. All of them have to agree, right? So they said the reason why they had to do a second count was because the the one holdout, was this same Atticus Hensley, right? So the reason why, so after this was only discovered after Leo Frank had been convicted, and the defense was trying to have a retrial, right? They were trying to have the conviction overturned and have a retrial based on a violation of due process, and so they wanted to challenge the partiality of the jury. So I'm going to stop this video here, and I'll continue with the evidence in the Leo Frank trial, in the anti-Semitic lynching of Leo Frank. My name is Oluro Timiosha, and I'll keep you posted.